This is our first video where we start to look in depth at how to do approaches, and we'll start with the ILS approach. In this video we're going to cover two of the three ways into Merced Regional, the ILS approach to runway 30. There is a third way. It may not be evident from the approach plate, but we'll point that out in the follow-up video. Our first is going to be coming from the south, and we're going to fly over the Panache VOR, shown here. Again, coming from the south, we're going to take the Panache VOR as our initial approach fix, and from there we'll fly the 031 radial in to intercept the localizer. You'll see that you really don't need to look outside the aircraft, figure out where you are, guess where you are. It's all going to lead you exactly where you need to be. So we first take a look at the approach plate, and then we'll take a look at the map where we're going to be coming from the south, as we said. Fly up to the Panache VOR. We won't cover flying to and from VORs. This was done in other videos, so if you aren't familiar with that, you should take a look at those videos first. Intercept the ILS localizer for runway 30, and then proceed to fly in from there. And you'll notice that this is about 32.2 DME. That means 32.2 miles as measured by DME from the Panache VOR to the intersection where we will intercept the localizer. However, you'll want to turn a couple of miles before this in large, fast aircraft, jets, typically at 200 knots or a little below, about 2.5 miles before. Small aircraft, you can get away with a mile or so before that. Stuff in between, something in between. So here we see ourselves, we're going to the Panache VOR. You see that the needle is nicely centered. You can set up the VOR and click nav, and it will fly you straight onto that heading. You have to remember that when you make a turn, though, that you'll want to disconnect the VOR and make the turn. Here we've started our descent. The point where you start your descent will depend on your preferred descent rate and your timing. That's a separate subject here. What we're looking at is simply how to get to the right spot. We will cover other information on judging descent rates and so on, but on the Elite Premier website there are some rules of thumb and some tables for identifying your top of descent point by various methods. And at this time we're descending at 3,000 feet per minute, and as you can see from the Panache VOR, we still have another 32.2 miles to go before the intercept point, so we have plenty of time to descend. We factor this into our descent rate, and note that we'll be overflying the Panache VOR at some altitude, probably about 2 nautical miles or higher above the VOR. We'll have to take that into account. Again, that was part of the flying VOR routes, and if you're not familiar with that, please see those videos. So here we've flown past the Panache VOR. Notice here on this scale we probably went by it by a mile or a little bit more. Completely acceptable. Intercepted the outbound radial. Nice gradual turn. And now we're proceeding away from the Panache VOR to our intercept point. We continue flying, continue descending, and we'll take a look at the chart again. We have 32.2 miles before Chowa, the intersection at the intercept of the localizer. Keep in mind here we're flying a jet. We'll want to make this turn. We'll start this turn at about 2.5 miles before that point. So roughly 30 DME from the Panache VOR. Here we can see we're just over 27 DME from the VOR, so we'll get ready to make our turn. Make that a little bit bigger for you to see, 27, almost 28 DME now at this point, and we are continuing our descent. Note that we're hand flying here at this time because we're going to want to rotate our HSI to our runway heading as a reference point. So we turn our HSI to 303 degrees, and if you do that ahead of time, it'll give you an idea of about where you're going to turn to. And again, fast aircraft like a turbofan jet you'll want to turn 2.5 miles beforehand. And notice that at the point we turn, Choa is about 10 miles still to Coop, where we have to maintain at or above 2,000 feet. So again, figuring out our descent is not all that critical. Here we're going to level off at 5,000 feet until we make the intercept. And at this point, 30 miles out, we're going to start our turn, and we'll switch our HSI to the runway heading, verify we have the ILS frequency in the standby, and we start our turn. So we switch the HSI to the runway heading, the other runway heading, and there we go. And right now we're still tuned to the Panache VOR, but you can see that this gives a reference to where we want to end up our turn. We're making a nice gradual turn here, just a little beyond 20 degrees. That's a relatively good turn rate, not too steep and not too slow. Again, we are using this as a reference point, and we are now at the runway heading. We've switched to the ILS frequency, and you'll see that even without having the ILS tuned, we're only about a degree or so to the right. So we'll correct a little bit, move over to the left. We've really got a good localizer intercept here. We're still over 13 DME out from the localizer. So move over a little, pick up the center line of the ILS, and continuing our descent, taking advantage of the fact that we must remain at or above 2,000 feet until we reach Coop, which is just a little less than 7 DME from the ILS. Here we see it, Coop 6.5 DME, and at or above 2,000 feet. And so we use this piece of the descent to lose some more altitude. It allowed us to stay at a higher altitude longer, gets us there faster, gets us there more efficient. So here we are, we're all lined up on the localizer, we're on the DME, you see the runway in sight, and without any trouble at all, we've found our way to the airport, and we'll make that last little correction for the visual and slide on in for a landing. So now we'll take a quick review of what we did. Flew up from the south, turned at the Panache VOR, flew outbound from the Panache VOR on the 031 radial. A couple of miles before Choa, the intercept point, we started our turn, turned left to the ILS heading, switched to the ILS frequency, lined ourselves up that little tweak to towards the left, and completed the approach and landed. Very simple, very straightforward. Second way in, now from the northeast, we're going to fly down towards the Clovis VOR. Technically, Clovis is an initial approach fix, and you would normally fly over it, much like we did the Panache VOR. I'm going to show you that you can fudge this a little bit. That's part of the fun of sim flying. You don't have to do everything exactly as planned. And in fact, in the real world, you could request an alternate initial approach fix. Here we are in the Learjet, departing Mammoth, Yosemite. The technique is similar to any other turbofan aircraft, a nice gradual increase in thrust to N1 of about 70% until you're around 60 knots. Then ease it up to departure power, here about 85 to 87%. Increase your speed, get to the rotate speed, pull the nose up. Here we're up at about 87%, and notice our altitude is 6,800 feet, so our density altitude is pretty high. We'll let our speed climb a little bit, and we'll pull the nose up to about 15 degrees. At this point, we'll pull our thrust back to our noise abatement level in the Learjet, that's 72%. And we'll hold the nose up at a pretty steep angle of climb, 15 degrees, until we're about 1,000 feet above ground level. That'd be about 76 or 7,800 feet. Ensuring we have good airspeed, we raise our flaps, drop our nose down in our acceleration phase, and hold it at about 7.5 degrees until our airspeed, indicated airspeed, gets to 235 to 240 knots. At which point you can proceed with your climb as you hold the runway heading until you're about 5,000 feet above ground level. Notice here we've got some mountains up to the north, but over here, much closer to the south, some mountains, so we're going to make a left turn and swing back around over the airport. A little common sense, a little thought ahead of time goes a long way when you're flying, keeps you from running into those rocks in the clouds. So here we are, we've taken off, made the left turn towards the mountains much farther to the north versus those to the south, and we're overflying the airport. Right now headed pretty much straight to Merced. But we're going to turn a little bit towards the east now and come closer down to the Clovis VOR, but we're not going to fly all the way to the VOR. We're going to pick it up somewhere in between Clovis and our initial arrival point on the localizer for Merced. And we'll show you how that's done in just a minute. Again, a lot of this is basic VOR flying, and we're not going to cover the details of that. We do have other videos for that, so please check those out if you need some extra assistance with that. And taking a look around, that's the Yosemite airport that we took off from. Notice the mountains to the north, pretty good distance away, versus those on the south side, pretty close. So hence the left turn out and overflying the airport. And here we are, we're going to now head in the general direction of the Clovis VOR, but we're not going to fly all the way to the Clovis VOR. We're going to kind of take a little bit of a shortcut as we described, and we'll show you how to figure that out by what's called the rule of 60. Again, some rules of thumb on the Elite Premier website if you're not familiar with that rule. But what we're going to do here is we're going to line our HSI up so it's pointing directly at the VOR, which is the Clovis VOR, and right now we're 51 DME away from that. And we're going to turn a little bit more to the left and get ourselves within 7 or 8 degrees or so of this heading. Notice we have a little bit of a quartering wind that's pushing us towards the right, so we'll have to compensate for that just a little bit. And right now we're nearing 45 DME, and we'll center up the needle one more time, and we'll move ourselves about 8 degrees to the right, 8 or 9 degrees to the right of this. And by the rule of 60, 45 DME out means that each degree of radial is about 3/4 of a mile. And in this case we're about 8 or 9 degrees to the right. That's going to put us about 6 miles right now on our heading to the right of the Clovis VOR. The rule of 60 again, 1 degree equals 1 nautical mile at 60 miles distance. Since we're 45 miles, that's about 3/4 of 60, so 1 degree equals about 3/4 of a mile. So right now we're kind of aiming for 7 or 8 miles or so to the right of Clovis. Remember, we got a little bit of a wind from the left that's going to push us a couple miles over, and we're not going to hold that the whole way. When we get within a few miles of the intercept, we're going to start turning to the right. But we will have plenty of room because from Clovis to Choa is more than 25 miles, so there will be no problem there. And even though we're going to do a little bit of a shortcut, we'll still have a lot of extra room before we need to get to our descent altitude. Notice we've already turned our HSI to the 282 radial, because in reality we're not really flying to the VOR, so it isn't anything more than a distance reference for us. Right now about 28 miles away. But as you can see, we're going to end up on this course 7 or 8 miles to the northeast, but in reality we're going to get down around this area a few miles before that and start turning a little bit more. So by the time we intercept the 282 radial, in reality we're going to be probably 12 or 14 miles away. Still plenty of room, and this is all sort of eyeball navigation, if you will, nothing very crucial about it. Once you are familiar with VOR navigation, you'll be quite used to this, and you can see that without a lot of trouble and a lot of concern, you can lead yourself right to the point where you need to be, at which point you'll have plenty of time to start the precision part of this approach, which will be to intercept the localizer at Choa and continue in and land without trouble. So again, we're going to pick this 282 radial up somewhere in the midpoint, maybe just a little bit towards Clovis, about 12-14 miles out. Turn on the 282 radial, intercept the localizer, and land just like we did when we came from the south over the Panache VOR. So here we've made a little bit of a turn, and we're going to try and pick this up at about between a 30 and 45 degree angle for the 282 radial. This is pretty standard intercept stuff for VORs. Again, check out our videos on that, and you can see now that we're flying actually away from the Clovis VOR, and we've got a little bit of an angle to the 282 radial, and we're going to just kind of watch that needle and wait until it starts to move, make the turn to the right, and intercept the radial. Again, more detail on this in our videos on VOR navigation. So at this point we're about 10 miles out, and we were kind of guesstimating that we would pick up the 282 radial at 12 or 14 miles away from Clovis. Continuing our descent, and keeping in mind one of the most important things about the approach plate is a minimum safe altitude circle. Here we want to be above 5,600 feet to be safe, so we're going to keep ourselves at 2,000 feet until we get to the feeder route, which would allow us to go down as low as 2,000 feet, but that's not at all necessary. Again, we have lots of time to get down to that 2,000 foot altitude that we must be at or above until we reach the Coupe intersection. So as you see, we've made the right hand turn to intercept the 282 radial from Clovis. Looks like about 13.5 miles out, so pretty good guess there. And we'll move a little bit to the right, this needle slightly to the right to get back on course, and you can see we're level at 6,000 feet, so we'll increase our power to hold this altitude for now. We'll continue inbound until about a mile or so before we get to Choa. Unlike the turn from Panache, which was a 90 degree angle, this is only about a 20 degree angle, so instead of the 2.5 miles or so ahead of time, 20 degrees or 30 degrees, about a third of that of a full turn. So you can use about a third of your usual distance, so a third of 2.5 miles or so, of roughly a mile, and it'll be a nice gradual intercept. Very similar technique as we used before. We're now starting our descent to get down a little bit lower. Remember, we need to stay at or above 2,000 feet until Coupe, so we do have plenty of time. We have about 9 miles before we get to Choa, and from Choa we have another 10 miles before we get to Coupe, so lots of time to get from 6,000 feet to 2,000 feet. So we continue on the 282 radial from the Clovis VOR. The intersection is at 25.6 DME from Clovis, so we'll probably start our turn at about 24.5 miles away. Plenty of time, and a nice gradual turn can be made here and intercept the localizer to fly inbound. So just as we did before, continuing to descend, watching our distance from Clovis, which will tell us when we're about to intercept the localizer. Again, we're going to give ourselves about a mile, so it'll be about 24.5 DME from Clovis when we make the intercept turn. Gradual descent in altitude. Notice our descent rate here is pretty gradual, a nice 1,200 feet per minute, not the 3,000 feet per minute we used for the en route descent. And we'll level off at 3,000 feet at this point. We'll do this kind of the opposite way we did the first one. We'll make the frequency switch first to the ILS frequency, and then we'll move the HSI to the runway heading 303 degrees. So we'll make the frequency change here in a moment, getting very close to the point where we're going to want to make the turn. And you see the localizer is off to the left. As a reference, we'll turn to the 303 degree heading so we kind of know where we're going to turn. Turn and intercept the localizer and center that needle as we did before. And once we're on the localizer, we can make fine adjustments, and we'll hold this altitude 3,000 feet. Keep in mind, at or above 2,000 until we get to the Coop intersection. And at this point we still have about another 10 miles to go, and you notice we're nicely below the glide slope. You always want to intercept the glide slope from below. We've set ourselves up in our initial landing configuration, 8 degrees of flaps, and we'll begin to slow the aircraft down to our secondary approach speed, somewhere around 180 knots. And you can see we've made the initial turn to pick up the radial from the Clovis VOR, flew that to Choa, and made the final small turn, lined up on the localizer, and in we go. Same as the last time now at this point. We are on the localizer and on the glide slope, just a hair above it this time around, but pretty close. And you can see that this route too has led us right to the point where we want to be to make a nice, calm, controlled approach into the airport. Few final adjustments. Make sure we're on the localizer, on the glide slope. You can turn your autopilot to the approach mode and allow it to fly for you, at least the LNAV portion. You'll still have to manage the throttles, of course, and to keep the proper speed and do the flaps and the gear and so on. But with a little practice, you'll learn to be able to hand fly these approaches, and that's actually, I think, a lot more fun than having the autopilot do all the work for you. It helps you hone your skills, and you'll be a better pilot for it and make better landings than if you let the autopilot fly most of the approach for you. So here we are, all lined up. And bring the nose up very slightly. The Learjet does tend to float a little bit, so not too much. And a nice gentle touchdown, a little bit better than the last one. That one had a little bit more tire smoke than we like to see. So to review once again what we did, coming from Yosemite, using the Clovis VOR as a reference, we kind of took a little bit of an angle, a little eyeball flying, if you will, to intercept the 282 radial of the Clovis VOR, at which point we knew exactly where we were and we could intercept the localizer. So this is 2 ways in. We have one more to explore, and that'll be presented in part 2. And in preparation for that, if you are not familiar with the flying VOR, then please review our videos on that, and we also have some information on the website to supplement that. And we will be using what's known as a procedure turn in our 3rd entry to this exact same runway. All of this is designed to get you here in a predictable way and safely. You don't run into any mountains, you don't have to ask for directions, you can find your own way. It's a lot of fun, so join us for part 2, and thanks for watching.